Imagine a single earthen pot resting on a cool stone ledge inside a room that has not heard the sound of a human voice for 700 years. It sits there, perfectly intact, its black and white geometric patterns still sharp, holding nothing but the dry, still air of the high desert. Nearby, a grinding stone remains exactly where it was placed centuries ago, leaning against a wall of hand-hewn sandstone blocks, as if its owner had simply stepped away for a moment to fetch water and never returned. There is a profound, heavy stillness in these canyons, a silence that feels less like an absence of sound and more like a presence of its own, a weight that has settled over the Four Corners region where the borders of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet in a vast, rugged embrace. The wind moves through the pinon pines and the gnarled juniper trees with a soft, shushing sound, carrying the scent of parched earth and ancient dust. As the light fades across the mesas, the shadows begin to stretch, filling the deep alcoves and the hollowed-out windows of the great stone dwellings that cling to the golden cliffs. It was into this world of shadow and stone that two cattle ranchers, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason, stumbled on a cold December day in 1888. They were searching for lost cattle through a heavy veil of falling snow when they reached the edge of a deep canyon and looked across the chasm. Through the white blur of the storm they saw something impossible. A silent city of stone, rising out of the cliffs like a mirage, its towers and balconies perfectly preserved in the dry, sheltered air of the overhanging rock. This was Mesa Verde, the green table, a place where time had seemingly frozen in place, leaving behind a haunting puzzle that remains unsolved to this day. The ranchers found more than just walls. As they explored the rooms, they found yucca fiber sandals, woven baskets, and piles of corn cobs that looked as though they had been harvested only a season ago. It was as if a whole civilization had simply stood up and walked away, leaving their most precious possessions behind. This sudden departure is what archaeologists call the Great Abandonment, a mass migration that saw thousands of people flee their ancestral homes in the late 13th century. But before we journey deeper into the mystery of why they left, if you are settling in for the night and finding comfort in these tales of the past, you are in the right place. Here at the Slumber Archives, we share new history narrations just like this one every single day, so if you find this relaxing, consider subscribing so you never miss a story. A simple like helps others discover our quiet corner of the world too. Now, let us return to the shadows of the canyon. To understand the people who built these magnificent structures, we must first consider what we call them. For a long time the world knew them as the Anasazi, a word borrowed from the Navajo language. In the Navajo tongue, the term carries a complex meaning, often translated as ancient enemies or ancient outsiders. It is a word that speaks to the perspective of those who arrived in the region long after the stone cities were already empty. However, the descendants of these builders, the modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, prefer the term Ancestral Puebloans. This name honors the continuity of their culture, a reminder that while the canyons were abandoned, the people did not vanish into thin air. They moved, they adapted, and they carried their traditions with them to new lands. Yet the question of why they left such sophisticated, hard-won homes remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the Americas. When we look at the ruins of places like Cliff Palace or Longhouse, we are looking at the pinnacle of a society that had flourished for over 1,000 years. These were not primitive shelters. They were masterpieces of masonry and celestial alignment. The ancestral Puebloans were master astronomers who could track the solstices and equinoxes with startling precision, carving markers into the rock to catch the first light of a changing season. They were engineers who managed water in an environment where every drop was a gift from the heavens, and yet Between the years 1275 and 1300, the entire population of the San Juan Basin, perhaps as many as 30,000 people, vanished from the region. The evidence left behind is both beautiful and unsettling. In some rooms, archaeologists have found kivas, circular underground ceremonial chambers, that were sealed shut with heavy stones. In others, they found evidence of hearths where the ashes were still cold, but the cooking pots were still in place. There is very little evidence of a gradual decline. Instead, the stratigraphy, which is simply the study of the layers of earth and debris left behind over time, suggests a sudden break. The layers of daily life, the broken pottery, the charcoal, the discarded tools, simply stop. Above them, there is only the dust of centuries. To determine the exact timing of this exodus, scientists use dendrochronology or tree ring dating. By looking at the growth rings in the wooden beams used to support the roofs of the dwellings, they can tell us not just the year a tree was cut, but often the very season. Through this meticulous science, we know that the final beams were placed in the late 1200s, and then the building simply ceased. As the years passed and the sun continued to bake the sandstone walls, the desert reclaimed the canyons. The great towers, some rising 4 stories high, became the homes of owls and swifts. The sophisticated society that had thrived here, cultivating maize and weaving intricate textiles, became a memory whispered in the winds. We find ourselves wondering about the limits of human endurance, how a people so deeply rooted in a landscape could decide, seemingly all at once, that the land could no longer hold them. Was it a change in the climate, a prolonged drought that withered the corn and dried the springs? Or was it something more internal, a social or spiritual fracturing that made the old ways impossible to maintain? The mystery of the great abandonment is a reminder of the fragility of even the most robust civilizations. It forces us to confront the concept of deep time, the vast, yawning stretches of history that exist far beyond our own short lives. When we walk through these silent cities, we are walking through a ghost of what was once a vibrant, noisy, and bustling world. There would have been the sound of children playing in the plazas, the rhythmic thwack of stone axes against wood, and the smell of roasting squash and deer meat wafting from the chimneys. Now there is only the scent of dry sage and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above the rim. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific theories that try to explain this mass migration, let us stay for a moment in this twilight space. Imagine the last family to leave their home in the cliff. They might have looked back one last time at the sturdy walls they had built with their own hands, the smooth floors polished by the feet of their ancestors. They left behind their heavy tools, their grinding stones, and their large jars, carrying only what was necessary for a long journey into the unknown south. They were moving toward a new horizon, leaving the silent canyons to the wind and the stars, leaving us to wonder, centuries later, what they knew that we have yet to discover. To understand the ending, we must first sink deep into the beginning, into the very marrow of the earth, where the story of the Ancestral Puebloans first found its footing. Long before the first stone was laid, the stage was being set by forces that operate on a scale of time we can scarcely comprehend. The Colorado Plateau is not merely a landscape, it is a vast, uplifted memory of an ancient sea, a high desert realm where the wind and the water have spent millions of years carving secrets into the sandstone. As the eons passed, the relentless cycle of freezing and thawing, combined with the patient scouring of seasonal rains, began to hollow out the soft layers of rock beneath the harder capstones. These geological sighs created the great alcoves, those deep, arched shadows in the canyon walls that seem almost expectant, as if the earth itself were providing a sanctuary for a people it knew would eventually arrive. These natural amphitheatres of stone offered a peculiar kind of protection, a stillness that whispered of safety and permanence in a world that was otherwise harsh and shifting. For thousands of years, the inhabitants of this high desert were ghosts upon the land, nomadic hunter-gatherers who followed the rhythms of the seasons and the migrations of the elk and the deer. They left little behind but the occasional flint point or the charcoal of a lonely campfire, moving with a lightness that barely brushed the surface of the earth. But slowly, as the climate shifted and the knowledge of the soil began to take root, a profound transformation occurred. The wanderers began to slow their pace. They started to look at the seeds of the wild grasses and the life-giving properties of the silt-heavy washes with a new kind of intention. This transition from the wandering life to the settled one was not a sudden event, but a gradual unfolding that archaeologists call the basket-maker periods. It is a time defined by an exquisite intimacy with the fibers of the world. Before they were architects of stone, these people were masters of the weave. They gathered the tough, fibrous leaves of the yucca and the supple bark of the juniper, transforming them into baskets so tightly coiled that they could hold water, and sandals so durable they could traverse the jagged rim rock for miles. There is a quiet beauty in the thought of a culture defined by the rhythm of the hand, interlacing the natural world into the tools of survival, a slow meditative process that mirrors the very patience of the desert itself. As the centuries drifted by, the settlers were introduced to three humble companions that would change the trajectory of their history forever: corn, beans, and squash. To the modern eye, these are simple staples, but in the context of the high desert, they were a miracle of biological engineering. They became known as the Three Sisters, a trio of plants that worked in a perfect, silent harmony. The corn grew tall, providing a sturdy stalk for the climbing beans to embrace. The beans, in turn, pulled nitrogen from the air and fed it back into the hungry soil. And the squash spread its broad, prickly leaves across the ground, acting as a living mulch that kept the precious moisture from evaporating under the relentless sun. With the arrival of the Three Sisters, the ancestral Puebloans were no longer beholden to the whims of the hunt. They could store the sun's energy in the form of dried kernels and beans, tucking them away in stone-lined pits for the lean months of winter. This surplus of food brought with it a surplus of time to think, to observe the stars, and to refine the art of living in one place. The early basket makers began to dig their homes into the earth, creating pithouses that were cool in the summer heat and warm against the biting winds of the plateau. These were circular dwellings, dug several feet deep into the soil and roofed with timber and mud, echoing the shape of the horizon and the cycle of the seasons. It is during this era that we see the first inklings of the complexity that would later define the great cliff dwellings. The weaving techniques that had once produced simple baskets were now being applied to more intricate designs, with feathers and rabbit fur being spun into warm blankets, and intricate patterns of black and red appearing on the surfaces of their vessels. Even as they lived in the earth, they were beginning to look upward, toward the mesas and the hidden recesses of the canyon walls. We often look at the ruins of the past and see only the silence of the stone, but in these early days, the canyons were alive with the sound of human industry and the smell of roasting corn. There was a growing sense of community, a shared understanding of the land's fragile bounty. They learned the language of the clouds and the subtle signs of a coming drought, developing a deep, spiritual connection to the water that seeped through the sandstone. They discovered that the very alcoves formed millions of years ago were not just shelters, but containers for sound and light, places where the winter sun would reach deep into the shadows to provide warmth, while the summer sun remained high and hidden. As we move through the timeline of the basket maker periods, from the 2nd century into the 7th, we see a people who were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their mastery of the environment. They were no longer merely surviving, They were curating a way of life that was in total conversation with the high desert. They were refining the art of pottery, moving away from the labor-intensive baskets toward the durability of clay, a material that allowed them to cook over open fires and store their harvests with even greater security. But even as their foundations grew stronger, there remained a haunting quality to their existence. The Colorado Plateau is a landscape of extremes, where a single year without rain can turn a thriving community into a desperate one. The evidence of their presence is written in the stratigraphy, that is, the layers of earth and debris that act as a ledger of time. Each layer tells a story of a wet year or a dry one, a season of plenty or a decade of struggle. Through the use of radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint the age of organic remains, we can see how their populations ebbed and flowed like a slow-motion tide against the cliffs. There is a weight to this deep time, a feeling that every stone they touched and every seed they planted was part of a much larger unfolding mystery. They were a people who lived at the edge of the possible, carving a civilization out of a place that seems, to our modern eyes, almost uninhabitable. And yet, they thrived. They built a world that was as beautiful as it was functional, a world where the architecture was an extension of the geology itself. As the basket maker era began to give way to the Pueblo periods, the scale of their ambition began to shift. The pit houses were becoming more elaborate, and the first hints of stone masonry began to appear on the surface of the ground. The transition from weaving to building, from the earth to the sky, was beginning to accelerate. They were preparing to leave the floor of the valley and the depths of the soil to ascend into the high, hidden places of the world. But as they climbed, the questions only grew more profound. Why would a people so rooted in the earth suddenly seek the precarious heights of the canyon walls? What were they watching for from those high vantage points, and what were they trying to protect? The foundations were laid, the three sisters were thriving, and the baskets were full. But the wind was changing. In the quiet of the high desert, the shadows were beginning to lengthen, and the first whispers of a great migration were already being carried on the air, centuries before the final stone was ever abandoned. We sit now in the silence of what they left behind, looking at the same stars they watched, wondering how a beginning so deliberate could lead to an ending so sudden and so absolute. Deep beneath the surface of the reddish earth, where the soil remains cool even in the height of the summer heat, the story of the ancestral Puebloans truly begins to take root. Before the towering cliffs were ever carved, before the sandstone blocks were stacked toward the heavens, there was the pit house. Imagine a circular room, excavated several feet into the ground, its floor a smooth expanse of packed clay, and its roof a heavy canopy of timber and mud. To step down into such a space is to leave the harsh, bright world of the plateau behind and enter a realm of soft shadows and constant temperature. These dwellings were masterpieces of thermal efficiency, utilizing the natural insulation of the earth to stay warm during the biting winters of the high desert and remarkably cool when the sun beat down upon the sagebrush above. The air inside would have smelled of juniper smoke and damp earth, a quiet sanctuary where the passage of time was measured not by the movement of the sun across the horizon, but by the slow flickering of the central hearth. As the years passed, these subterranean homes became the foundation of a new way of living, a shift from the wandering life of the hunter-gatherer to the settled existence of the farmer. These were not yet the sprawling cities of the later eras, but rather small, intimate clusters of family units. A handful of pit houses might sit together on a ridge, their low, mounded roofs looking like natural hillocks to a distant observer. Within these small circles, life was deeply communal. Families worked the soil together, shared the bounty of the harvest, and huddled around the same fires to tell the stories of their ancestors. There is a profound sense of continuity in this design, a feeling that to live within the earth was to remain connected to the very source of life itself. The pit house was more than just a shelter from the wind. It was a physical manifestation of a people finding their place within the landscape, rooting themselves into the dirt of the Four Corners region with a quiet, enduring strength. Central to this subterranean world was a feature that whispers to us of a deeply spiritual reality, a small, unassuming hole in the floor known as the sipapu. In the language of the Hopi, who are among the descendants of these ancient people, the sipapu represents the place of emergence, the portal through which the first humans climbed from the dark underworld into the light of the present day. Even in these early humble dwellings, the ancestral Puebloans were mindful of their origins. The sipapu was a symbolic anchor, a reminder that the world they inhabited was layered, and that the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was as thin as a veil of smoke. To sit in a pit house was to sit at the threshold of the cosmos, with the hearth fire representing the sun and the small opening in the floor connecting the living to the spirits of the deep past. One cannot help but wonder if, in the stillness of the night, they listened at the edge of that small hole, waiting for a message from the world below. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was taking place in the hands of the women who sat near those hearths. For generations, the people had been known as the basket makers, weaving intricate, watertight vessels from yucca fibers and willow strands with a skill that bordered on the miraculous. But as the pit house era progressed, a new material began to replace the organic textures of the past. They discovered that the grey and red clays of the desert, when shaped and subjected to the transformative power of fire, could become something permanent. This was the birth of their ceramic tradition. Early pottery was often simple, sometimes even pressed into the shapes of the very baskets they were meant to replace, mirroring the weave of the fibre in the hardened clay. As the years passed, these vessels became smoother, thinner, and more sophisticated. The shift from basketry to pottery was not merely a change in utility, it was a sign of a people who were no longer moving, who no longer needed the light, flexible containers of a nomadic life. They were building a world intended to last, fire-hardening their future one bowl at a time. The transition from the flexible to the brittle, from the woven to the fired, speaks to a growing confidence in the stability of their environment. With pottery, they could store grain for longer periods, protecting the precious maize from moisture and rodents with heavy stone lids. This allowed the populations to grow, the family clusters to expand, and the social fabric to become more complex. Yet even as they mastered the earth and the flame, the design of the pit house remained a constant. It was a blueprint that worked, a marriage of human ingenuity and the natural world's own offerings. The semi-subterranean nature of these homes meant that the people lived half in the light and half in the dark, a balanced existence that seemed to mirror the duality of their spiritual beliefs. They were a people of the soil, literally and figuratively, building their lives within the very ground that fed them. As we look back through the lens of stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth that accumulate over centuries, we see the pit house era as a long period of quiet preparation. Archaeologists use radiocarbon dating, measuring the decay of carbon isotopes in the charred remains of old roof beams, to pin these structures to a timeline that stretches back over 1,500 years. But the numbers on a page can hardly capture the feeling of standing in a reconstructed pit house today, feeling the sudden drop in temperature and the heavy, protective silence of the walls. It is a space that demands a slower pace, a lower voice. It is the architectural equivalent of a deep breath. And so, the ancestral Puebloans lived for centuries, their villages dotting the mesas and valleys like seeds waiting to sprout. They watched the stars turn above the smoke holes of their roofs, the Great Bear and the North Star serving as silent witnesses to a culture that was becoming increasingly refined. The social organization was likely egalitarian, with decisions made through consensus and a shared responsibility for the well-being of the group. There were no palaces here, no monuments to individual kings. Instead, there was the collective strength of the family unit, bound together by the necessity of the harvest and the shared warmth of the subterranean room. It was a time of relative peace, a long afternoon in the history of the Southwest where the balance between man and nature seemed, for a time, to be perfectly struck. But the desert is a fickle companion. Even in the height of the Pithouse Era, there were signs that the climate was not a static thing. The tree rings tell a story of fluctuating rainfall, of decades where the rains were generous, and decades where the sky remained a hard, taunting blue. The people adapted, moving their fields, deepening their storage pits, and refining their ceremonies to better petition the spirits of the rain. They were learning the language of the land, a language of subtle shifts and hidden dangers. The Pithouse, for all its comfort and symbolic power, was only the first chapter. As the population continued to swell and the demands on the environment grew, the Ancestral Puebloans would eventually begin to climb out of the earth, leaving the circular safety of the Pithouse for the vertical challenges of the stone masonry that would define their next great age. Yet the memory of the Pithouse never truly faded. Even when they moved into the great stone apartment complexes of Chaco Canyon or the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, they continued to build circular, subterranean rooms. These would become the kivas, the sacred heart of every pueblo and village, where the sipapu would still be found, and where the most important ceremonies would still take place. The Pithouse was the ancestor of the kiva, a reminder that no matter how high they built their walls, their spiritual home would always be found within the earth. It is a testament to the power of origins, a thread of continuity that runs through the centuries, binding the early farmers to the master architects who would follow. As we sit in the stillness of this thought, we can almost hear the soft scraping of a bone needle against a hide, or the rhythmic grinding of corn on a stone metate. The Pithouse Era was a time of foundations, a period where the essential character of a civilization was forged in the cool shadows of the underground. It was a beginning characterized by a deep, abiding respect for the earth and a recognition of the sacredness of the everyday. But as the shadows of the mesas grew longer and the whispers of change became louder, the people of the pit houses began to look upward, toward the cliffs and the mesas, where a new and more complex destiny awaited them. A destiny that would eventually lead to the very heights they would one day so mysteriously choose to leave behind. The sound of a stone hammer striking a slab of sandstone is a rhythmic, steady heartbeat that echoes across the centuries. A persistent tapping that signaled the end of the age of the Pithouse and the dawn of something far more ambitious. As the 11th century began to unfold, a collective vision seemed to take hold of the people, pulling their focus from the subterranean depths into the bright, uncompromising light of the mesa tops. This era, which archaeologists call the Pueblo II period, was not merely a change in building materials. It was a profound transformation of the human spirit and its relationship with the landscape. The earth-sheltered dwellings of their ancestors were not forgotten, but they were now being reimagined as the foundations for towering monuments of stone. The transition was gradual at first, a slow migration of stone upon stone, until the horizon was punctuated by the silhouettes of the great houses. These were not simply shelters, but massive multi-story complexes that rose like artificial cliffs against the sky. To walk through these ruins today is to feel the weight of an incredible architectural explosion, a moment in time when the ancestral Puebloans mastered the geometry of the desert. They moved away from the simple, rounded forms of the past and embraced the precision of the right angle and the soaring height of the vertical wall. The masonry techniques they developed during this time are nothing short of miraculous when one considers the tools at their disposal. They did not have metal chisels or draft animals to haul the heavy loads, only their hands, their patience, and a deep understanding of the medium, They learned to shape the local sandstone into uniform blocks, often facing them with a decorative veneer that shimmered in the midday heat. Between these stones, they layered a fine mortar of clay and sand, sometimes inserting tiny shards of pottery or small pebbles, a technique known as chinking, to stabilize the walls and add a subtle, textured beauty to the facade. As these structures climbed toward the clouds, reaching 3 or even 4 stories in height, the engineering challenges became immense. They had to account for the tremendous weight of the upper levels, thickening the base walls to several feet wide and using massive timber beams, often hauled from forests over 50 miles away, to support the ceilings. The sheer logistics of this construction suggest a level of social organization that is difficult for us to fully grasp. A society where hundreds of individuals worked in concert, driven by a shared purpose that transcended the needs of the individual family unit. At the heart of these sprawling stone complexes lay the plaza, an expansive, open-air stage where the pulse of the community was most visible. If the pithouses were private sanctuaries, the plazas were the public soul of the great house. These flat, hard-packed spaces served as the center of gravity for daily life, where the air would have been thick with the smell of roasting maize and the sound of children playing. It was here that the various lineages and clans converged, sharing stories, trading goods, and participating in the elaborate ceremonies that kept their world in balance. The plaza was more than just a gathering place. It was a carefully designed space that connected the terrestrial world with the celestial one. The great houses were often aligned with astronomical precision, their walls and windows positioned to capture the first light of the winter solstice or the shifting shadows of the equinox. From the vantage point of the plaza, one could look up at the towering walls and feel both the protection of the community and the vastness of the cosmos. It was a landscape of symmetry and order, a physical manifestation of a belief system that sought to mirror the harmony of the stars on the dusty floor of the desert. But this architectural flowering was not born of aesthetic desire alone. It was a desperate and brilliant response to the challenges of an arid environment. As the population grew and the climate shifted, the people had to become masters of the water that sustained them. They looked at the summer monsoons, which sent sudden, violent torrents of rain rushing down the arroyos, and they saw a resource that could be tamed. Across the slopes and canyons, they began to construct an intricate network of check dams, small sturdy walls of stone built across the drainage channels. These dams were not meant to stop the water entirely, but to slow it down, allowing the precious silt to settle and creating small, fertile terraces for farming. It was a form of landscape engineering that required a profound knowledge of topography and hydrology. They understood how the water moved, where it pooled, and how to guide it through a series of canals and reservoirs to the thirsty roots of their crops. In the silence of the modern desert, you can still find the remains of these ancient waterworks, low ridges of stone half buried in the sand, silent witnesses to a time when every drop of rain was a gift to be cherished and managed with the utmost care. This sophisticated water management allowed the great houses to flourish in places that would otherwise have been uninhabitable, supporting a population that was becoming increasingly specialized and interconnected. The Pueblo II period was a time of abundance and confidence, a golden age where the mastery of stone and water seemed to promise a future of endless growth. The great houses of Chaco Canyon and the surrounding regions became the centers of a vast regional system, connected by a mysterious network of roads that stretched like spokes from a wheel across the high plateau. These roads, often perfectly straight and 30 feet wide, carved through the bedrock and climbed over mesas, seemingly indifferent to the obstacles of the terrain. What was the purpose of these great thoroughfares? Were they trade routes for the movement of turquoise, macaw feathers, and seashells? Or were they sacred pathways intended for pilgrims traveling to the great houses for seasonal rituals? The archaeology tells us of the things they carried, but it cannot tell us the prayers they whispered as they walked. We see the stratigraphy, the layers of earth and debris that build up over time, and we can date the charcoal in their hearths using radiocarbon techniques, which measure the decay of carbon isotopes to tell us exactly when a fire last burned. But these scientific tools, as precise as they are, only touch the surface of the experience. The great houses were more than just buildings, they were a statement of belonging. By stacking stone upon stone, the people were anchoring themselves to the land, claiming a place in the long lineage of the desert. They were moving away from the ephemeral nature of the pit house and towards something permanent, something that would endure long after they were gone. And yet, even as the walls rose higher and the plazas grew more vibrant, the seeds of a profound change were being sown. As the years passed, the very success of this period may have created its own vulnerabilities. The concentration of people into these massive complexes put a tremendous strain on the local resources. The forests were thinned to provide timber for the great houses, and the soil, though carefully managed, was taxed by centuries of continuous farming. The climate, always a fickle companion in the southwest, began to show signs of instability. The rains that had once been predictable became erratic, and the long sun-drenched days began to feel less like a blessing and more like a burden. The people of the great houses were living at the edge of what was possible, balanced on a fine line between prosperity and collapse. They had built a world of stone and shadow, a world of intricate beauty and remarkable resilience. But it was a world that depended on a delicate equilibrium with the natural world. As we look at the ruins of these magnificent structures today, we see the remnants of a civilization that reached for the sky, unaware that the very heights they achieved would one day make the eventual descent all the more poignant. The mystery of the great houses lies not just in how they were built, but in the mindset of the people who inhabited them. Did they feel a sense of triumph as they looked out from their high balconies? Or did they already sense the fragility of their achievement? The stones remained silent, holding the secrets of 1,000 years within their weathered grain. We are left to wander through the empty plazas, listening for the echoes of a life that was once so vibrant, so certain of its place in the world, and wondering at the forces that would eventually lead them to turn their backs on these monuments and seek a new path in the hidden recesses of the cliffs. Imagine a single bead of turquoise, smoothed by human hands and lost in the dust of a canyon floor, a tiny fragment of sky resting in the shadows of the earth. This small, silent object is a doorway into the heart of the Chaco Phenomenon, a moment in time when the scattered families of the high desert coalesced into something far more complex and far more mysterious than simple survival. To understand why they eventually left, we must first understand the height of what they built, and the epicenter of this vast, radiating energy was a place we now call Pueblo Bonito. It sits in the shallow embrace of Chaco Canyon, a massive D-shaped complex that rose 4 or 5 stories into the dry air, containing hundreds of rooms and dozens of circular, subterranean ceremonial chambers known as kivas. As the years passed, this was not merely a village, but a spiritual and logistical heartbeat for an entire region. Looking at its curved walls today, one feels the weight of intentionality. The masonry is not merely functional, it is a tapestry of stone with layers of thin, dark tablets alternating with thicker blocks, creating a rhythmic pattern that seems to vibrate under the midday sun. Archaeologists, using the science of dendrochronology, the study of tree rings to determine the exact year a beam was cut, have found that the construction of this great house spanned 3 centuries, beginning in the middle of the 9th century. It was a project of generations, a slow unfolding of a vision that transcended the life of any one architect. But the mystery of Pueblo Bonito deepens when we look not at the stones themselves, but at where they point. The people of Chaco were masters of archaeoastronomy, a field where we study how ancient cultures aligned their buildings with the movements of the heavens. The great walls of the complex are not oriented by whim. They are locked into the cycles of the sun and the moon with a precision that rivals the modern era. The mid-wall of Pueblo Bonito runs exactly north to south, a perfect meridian that bisects the structure. Even more profound is their understanding of the lunar standstill, a complex cycle that takes 18.5 years to complete. They built their world to mirror the sky, perhaps believing that by anchoring their homes to the celestial bodies, they could ensure the stability of the rains and the fertility of the corn. They lived in a landscape where the horizon was a calendar and every sunrise was a measurement of their place in the cosmos. Radiating outward from this central hub is perhaps the most enigmatic feature of all, the Great North Road. This is not a trail worn by the casual passage of feet following the easiest terrain. Instead, it is a wide engineered pathway that stretches for 30 miles, heading almost perfectly north toward the edge of the Chaco Canyon. Where the land rises, the road does not curve, it climbs. Where a cliff blocks the path, the road continues with carved stairways. In a world without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden, the sheer scale of these roads, some 30 feet wide, suggests a purpose far beyond simple commerce. They represent a physical manifestation of a spiritual direction. To the modern eye, they look like highways to nowhere, ending abruptly at the edges of plateaus, but to the Chacoans they may have been pathways for the spirits, or symbolic tethers linking the world of the living to the place of their ancestors in the north. As we walk through the quiet corridors of the great house, the silence is filled by the ghosts of things that should not be here. In the deep layers of the trash mounds and the sealed rooms, researchers have uncovered evidence of a trade network that stretched thousands of miles to the south into the tropical heart of Mesoamerica. There are the skeletal remains of scarlet macaws, their vibrant red and blue feathers once offering a stark, beautiful contrast to the browns and ochres of the desert. These birds were brought up through the rugged mountains of Mexico, kept alive as precious, sacred captives. Even more surprising is the discovery of chemical residues on cylindrical pottery jars, traces of theobromine, the telltale signature of cacao. The people of Chaco were drinking chocolate, a luxury imported from the rainforests, whisked into froth and shared in the darkness of the kivas. This was a society that had reached out and touched the edges of the known world, drawing in the exotic and the divine. They traded turquoise from local mines for seashells from the Pacific and copper bells from the south. The Chaco Phenomenon was a grand experiment in connectivity, a web of outlier communities linked by the great roads and a shared sense of ritual. Yet, as we look at the sheer perfection of their masonry and the opulence of their trade, a question lingers in the cool air of the canyon. Was this vast network a source of strength, or was it a delicate veneer, a complex system that required everything to go right in order to survive? The mystery of their departure begins to take root here, in the very height of their success. We see the expansion, the massive investment of labor, and the obsessive tracking of the stars, and we wonder if they were trying to control a world that was slowly becoming unpredictable. The stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth and debris, shows us that for a long time the system worked. The rains fell, the corn grew, and the macaws screamed in the plazas. But the higher one builds, the further there is to fall. The straight lines of the roads, the celestial alignments of the walls, and the precious items from distant lands all point to a culture that valued order and symmetry above all else. And so, we sit in the shadow of the great canyon wall, looking at the empty sockets of the windows in Pueblo Bonito. The wind whistles through the gaps in the stones, a lonely sound that carries the scent of sage and ancient dust. We are witnessing the peak of a civilization that had mastered its environment, yet within these very walls, the seeds of the great abandonment were already being sown. The exotic feathers would eventually fade, the chocolate jars would be broken and left behind, and the Great North Road would be reclaimed by the shifting sands. The Chacoans had built a monument to the eternal, yet they lived in a world defined by change. As the climate began to shift and the predictable cycles of the moon no longer guaranteed the arrival of the monsoons, the people of the canyon were forced to reconcile their grand vision with the harsh reality of the high desert. The transition from these open, sun-drenched plazas to the defensive, hidden recesses of the cliffs was not a sudden whim, but a slow, painful realization that the world they had so carefully constructed was no longer enough to sustain them. The sound of a stone scraper against a cedar branch, the sharp scent of juniper smoke trapped beneath a ceiling of ancient rock, and the rhythmic thud of sandals on sandstone. These were the quiet markers of a profound shift in the way of life for the ancestral Puebloans. By the middle of the 13th century, the transition was nearly complete, as entire communities abandoned the open air of the mesa tops to descend into the deep, echoing alcoves of the canyon walls. This was not a move born of convenience, for it demanded a level of physical exertion and architectural brilliance that still defies easy explanation today. To look upon these structures now is to see a civilization literally folding itself into the earth, seeking the protection of the great mother rock as the world above became increasingly uncertain. As the years passed, the landscape began to change from a series of scattered farmsteads into a vertical world of gravity-defying masonry. At places like Cliff Palace, the sheer scale of the endeavor is staggering to behold. Here, in a vast sandstone amphitheater, the inhabitants constructed over 150 individual rooms and 23 kivas, the circular, subterranean ceremonial chambers that served as the spiritual heart of their society. They used local sandstone, shaped into rectangular blocks with nothing but harder river stones, and bound them together with a mortar made of clay, water, and ash. The engineering was precise, often incorporating the natural contours of the cave floor and the overhanging ceiling to create multi-story dwellings that reached upward like fingers toward the sky. In the quiet of the canyon, one can almost hear the echoes of the masons at work, their voices muffled by the thick stone walls as they balanced on precarious scaffolding to lay the foundations of a city in the air. Meanwhile, at Spruce Tree House, the preservation is so remarkable that it feels as though the inhabitants might return at any moment to relight the hearths. The roofs of the kivas, constructed of interlocking logs in a cribbed pattern, remain as a testament to their mastery of structural tension. This was a world of tight, interconnected spaces where the privacy of the individual was sacrificed for the security of the collective. To move through these dwellings was to navigate a labyrinth of ladders and small T-shaped doorways, designed perhaps to keep the warmth of a fire inside, or perhaps to force an intruder to stoop and expose their neck as they entered a room. The mystery of their intent remains locked within the stone, a silent dialogue between the past and the present that we can only hope to translate through the study of stratigraphy. The careful analysis of the layers of debris and earth that have accumulated over the centuries. The daily logistics of life in these alcoves were nothing short of heroic. Imagine, if you will, the effort required to simply survive in a home perched hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Every drop of water, every ear of corn, and every piece of firewood had to be carried up or down the vertical cliffs. The inhabitants carved shallow depressions into the rock, known as toe holds or moki steps, which they used to scale the sheer faces with the agility of mountain goats. Women would have balanced heavy ceramic jars filled with water from distant springs on their heads, navigating the narrow ledges with a steady grace that is difficult for the modern mind to fathom. The sheer physical toll of this existence is etched into the very bones of the people found in the archaeological record, showing signs of heavy wear on the joints and the telltale markers of a life spent in constant vertical motion. Yet despite the immense labor required to live here, the cliff dwellings offered a thermal regulation that the mesa tops could never provide. The deep alcoves acted as a natural thermostat, shielding the homes from the blistering desert sun during the height of summer, while the thick sandstone walls absorbed the low-angled heat of the winter sun, radiating it back into the living quarters long after the light had faded. In the dead of winter, when the snow blanketed the plateau above, the cliff dwellers remained in a pocket of relative warmth, protected from the biting winds. It was a sophisticated understanding of the environment, a way of working with the geology of the earth rather than against it. As we contemplate these ruins, we must also consider the defensive advantages that such locations provided. From the vantage point of a cliff dwelling, one could see for miles down the canyon, watching for the movement of game or the approach of strangers. The narrow paths and steep climbs made these villages nearly impregnable to any large-scale assault. Was it a fear of other people that drove them into the rocks, or a fear of the changing climate? Perhaps it was both. A slow-motion crisis where dwindling resources led to social friction, forcing the ancestral Puebloans to retreat into these stone fortresses to protect what little they had left. There is a profound sense of intentionality in the way these structures were built. They were not merely shelters, but expressions of a complex social order and a deep spiritual connection to the place. The alignment of certain windows and portals with the movements of the sun and stars suggests that even in their retreat, the people remained keenly aware of their place in the cosmos. They were living in the interface between the earth and the sky, suspended in a liminal space that felt both permanent and precarious. The silence that now hangs over Cliff Palace is not the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a house whose owners have simply stepped out for a moment, leaving behind the tools of their lives and the echoes of their stories. As the sun sets over the canyon today, the shadows stretch long across the sandstone, and the cliff dwellings seem to melt back into the rock from which they were carved. We are left to wonder about the conversations held around the kiva fires, the songs sung while grinding corn, and the quiet moments of reflection as a father watched his children climb the mucky steps for the first time. The transition into the cliffs was a monumental chapter in the history of the Southwest, a period of intense creativity and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. And yet, even as they perfected this way of life, the seeds of the great abandonment were already beginning to sprout, hidden in the drying soil and the thinning clouds of a world that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable to those who called it home. The story of a civilization is often written not in their words, but in their rings, the thin, concentric circles hidden within the heart of a tree, that act as a silent diary of the sky. If we were to look through a microscope at a cross-section of a Douglas fir harvested from the ruins of Mesa Verde, we would see a terrifying narrowing of these lines. Dendrochronology, the science of dating events through tree ring growth, reveals a grim reality beginning in the year 1276. For 23 consecutive years, the rings become so tight, so microscopic, that they seem to gasp for air, or rather, for water. This was the Great Drought, a mega-drought of such unrelenting severity that it fundamentally altered the chemistry of the earth and the destiny of the people who relied upon it. As the 13th century progressed, the atmosphere above the Four Corners region grew thin and brittle. The summer monsoons, which had once arrived with the predictable weight of a heartbeat, began to falter. The clouds would gather, dark and promising, only to be swept away by hot, dry winds before a single drop could touch the parched mesas. Maize, the sacred lifeblood of the Puebloan people, is a thirsty crop that demands precision from the heavens. When the rains became erratic, the stalks grew stunted and pale, their leaves curling inward like the fingers of a starving man. The harvest, which once filled the great stone granaries to the brim, began to dwindle until the surplus was gone, and the people were living season to season, then month to month, then day to day. While the sky refused to give, the earth itself was beginning to expire. For centuries these communities had farmed the same upland soils, coaxing life from the dirt with ingenious dry farming techniques. But even the most respectful steward cannot take forever without giving back. The soil was becoming depleted, its vital nutrients exhausted by generations of corn, beans, and squash. The land was tired, and as the crops failed, the ancestral Puebloans looked to the forests for salvation, but there too the balance had shifted. To build their magnificent cliff dwellings and to keep their ceremonial fires burning through the cold, high desert winters, they had cleared vast swaths of piñon and juniper. The timber resources were receding further and further from the village centers, forcing the men to travel miles just to find a single sturdy beam. With the trees gone, the topsoil had nothing to hold it in place, and the rare, violent storms that did occur served only to wash the precious earth down into the deep canyons, leaving behind a sterile, rocky wasteland. The silence of the forest grew deeper as the animals began to vanish. In the earlier centuries, the refuse heaps of the villages were filled with the bones of mule deer and elk, evidence of a diet rich in protein and a wilderness teeming with life. But as the drought persisted and the human population grew, the pressure on the local wildlife became unsustainable. The large game moved higher into the mountains or succumbed to the lack of forage, leaving the hunters to return with smaller and smaller prizes. Eventually, the deer disappeared almost entirely from the archaeological record of the late 13th century, replaced by the bones of domestic turkeys and small rodents. The grandeur of the hunt had been reduced to a desperate search for anything that moved. Imagine the quiet desperation of a village leader standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out over a landscape that had once been a garden. The air is thick with dust, and the heat shimmers over fields that no longer turn green in July. The birds have stopped singing, and the tracks of the elk have been filled by the drifting sand. It was not a single catastrophe that broke the spirit of the Anasazi, but a slow, grinding accumulation of losses. The water was gone, the wood was gone, the meat was gone, and the soil was spent. As the year 1299 approached, the Great Drought reached its peak, and the people realized that the cliffs, for all their beauty and protection, could not provide the one thing they needed most, a future. The abandonment was no longer a possibility. It was becoming an inevitability, whispered by the wind through the empty branches of dying trees. The sound of a sharpening stone against a flint blade is a rhythmic, grating whisper that would have echoed through the alcoves of Mesa Verde as the 13th century began to wane. It is the sound of a society preparing for something other than the harvest. For generations, the ancestral Puebloans had lived in relatively open settlements, their homes scattered across the tops of the mesas like seeds cast upon a fertile field. But as the climate turned cold and the rains failed to arrive, the architecture of the Four Corners region underwent a profound and chilling transformation. The people began to pull inward, retreating from the sun-drenched plateaus into the deep, shadowed recesses of the canyon walls. They built high, they built thick, and they built with an unmistakable eye for defense. Access to these new dwellings was restricted to narrow toe-holds carved into the sheer rock or retractable wooden ladders that could be pulled up at the first sign of a stranger on the horizon. This was no longer just a way of life, it was a siege mentality carved into the very earth. Archaeologists looking at the stratigraphy, that is, the layered history of the soil where each deeper level represents an older era, have noted a disturbing trend in the late 1200s. There is a sudden spike in evidence of trauma. We find charred roof beams that were not burned by accident, but by firebrands. We find skeletal remains that bear the unmistakable marks of violence. The peace that had defined the Chacoan era was dissolving into a fragmented landscape of fear. When resources become scarce, the social contract often begins to fray at the edges. A neighbor is no longer a partner in trade, but a competitor for the last remaining pockets of moisture. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance must have been immense. A heavy, invisible weight carried by every parent watching the canyon rim, and every child who learned to play in silence so as not to betray their location. As the physical world crumbled, the spiritual world was forced to adapt, or perhaps it began to shatter. For centuries, the Chacoan political system had functioned as a grand, centralized machine, radiating outward from the great houses of Chaco Canyon. It was a system built on the promise of cosmic order, a belief that if the ceremonies were performed correctly and the alignments with the stars were maintained, the rains would come and the corn would grow. But as the Great Drought stretched into its second and third decades, that promise was revealed to be hollow. The old gods seemed to have turned their faces away. We see evidence of this spiritual crisis in the changing layout of the kivas, those circular, subterranean rooms used for prayer and community gathering. In some areas, the kivas were being closed off or even ritually destroyed, as if the people were intentionally breaking their connection to a religious system that had failed them in their hour of greatest need. There is a quiet desperation in the way new altars were constructed, and new symbols began to appear on the rock walls. It was a search for new answers, a frantic reaching out into the metaphysical void. Some scholars suggest that a new religious movement was beginning to sweep through the cliffs, one that emphasized internal community cohesion over the old, grand hierarchies of the past. The Chacoan system, once so vast and imposing, was fragmenting into smaller, isolated units. The great houses stood like silent, empty monuments to a fallen dream, while the people they once governed huddled in the cliffs, looking for a sign that the world might still hold some mercy. This fragmentation was not just political, it was a breaking of the collective spirit. The threads that held the society together, the trade routes that brought turquoise and macaw feathers from the south, the shared labor of the harvest, the communal songs, were snapping one by one under the strain of starvation and the ever-present shadow of conflict. Imagine the atmosphere in a place like Cliff Palace during those final years. The air would have been thick with the smell of wood smoke and the dry, dusty scent of parched earth. Families would have been squeezed into tight quarters, their movements constrained by the stone walls and the dizzying drops into the canyon floor below. Every scrap of food would have been measured and guarded. In such an environment, the social structures that once provided stability likely became instruments of control or sources of bitter resentment. The elders, who held the traditional knowledge of the seasons, may have found their wisdom questioned as the rains refused to fall. The warriors, once protectors, may have become the only voice of authority in a world defined by the threat of the other. It was a society under a pressure so intense that it was changing the very nature of what it meant to be a member of the community. The decision to leave was likely not a single unified moment, but a series of fractures. One family would slip away in the night, heading south toward the rivers that still flowed. Then another. The abandonment was a slow bleeding out of a culture that had reached its breaking point. As the population dwindled, the burden on those who remained grew even heavier. Who would maintain the walls? Who would stand guard? Who would perform the dances to keep the world in balance? The abandonment of the cliff dwellings was the final act of a long, agonizing struggle between a people and an environment that had become unrecognizable. They were leaving behind more than just stone and mortar. They were leaving behind the memory of who they were when the world was green. And as they walked away, they left the doors open and the pots resting on the hearths as if they expected to return, or as if they were in too much of a hurry to ever look back. We often wonder what they felt as they took those last steps out of the canyons. Was it a sense of failure or a profound sense of relief? The archaeology can tell us about the broken bones and the burnt wood, but it cannot tell us the stories they told their children to explain why they were walking into the unknown. It cannot capture the sound of a mother's sigh as she left her grinding stone behind, or the look in a young man's eyes as he took one last glance at the towers his grandfather had built. The great abandonment was a testament to human resilience, but it was also a tragedy of the highest order, a moment when the weight of the present became too heavy for the foundations of the past to bear. The silence that followed was not the silence of a peaceful sleep, but the ringing silence of a sudden departure, leaving only the wind to wander through the empty rooms and the dust to settle over the secrets of a civilization that had simply run out of time. As the years passed, the desert began to reclaim the paths they had worn into the rock. The defensive walls, once so vital, became nothing more than perches for hawks and shelters for scorpions. The fragmentation was complete. The Chacoan world was no longer a map of connected points, but a collection of ghosts. And yet, in the very act of leaving, the people ensured their survival. By abandoning the structures that had become their prisons, they carried the seeds of their culture into new lands, where they would eventually take root and bloom once more in the Rio Grande Valley and the high mesas of the Hopi. The cliffs were left behind, but the people remained, changed, scarred, and forever marked by the pressure of the Great Drought, but alive. The stories of the cliff dwellings are not just stories of stone, they are stories of the human spirit's capacity to endure when the world itself seems to be coming to an end. To walk through the silent corridors of Mesa Verde or the wind-swept alcoves of Canyon de Chelly today is to step into a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of a civilization caught in the act of vanishing. There is a profound, unsettling stillness in the way these homes were left, a quality of suddenness that defies the slow, methodical pace of a planned migration. When we look closely at the archaeological record, at the stratigraphy, or the layered history of the earth beneath our feet, we find evidence that contradicts the idea of a peaceful, leisurely departure. It was not a slow fading out, but a sharp, jagged break in the timeline of the Southwest. In the deepest recesses of the sandstone cliffs, tucked away in the driest, most protected corners of the masonry, sit the granaries. These small, beehive-shaped structures were the lifeblood of the Ancestral Puebloans, designed to keep their precious stores of maize and squash safe from rodents and moisture. In many of these abandoned sites, archaeologists have discovered something haunting. The granaries are not empty. They remain filled with thousands of ears of unconsumed corn, still tucked away in the dark, waiting for mouths that would never return to eat them. To leave behind your entire food supply in a landscape defined by scarcity is an act of desperation or extreme haste. It suggests that the decision to leave was not made over a season of reflection, but perhaps over a single, terrifying night. As the years passed and the dust began to settle over the empty plazas, the objects of daily life remained exactly where they had been used last. We find heavy metates, the large stone basins used for grinding corn, still resting on the floors of the dwellings. These stones are incredibly heavy, often weighing 40 or 50 pounds, and while one might understand why a fleeing family would choose not to carry them across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain, their presence speaks to a total abandonment of the tools of survival. Alongside them sit beautifully crafted cooking pots, some still containing the charred remains of a final meal, and delicate yucca fiber sandals tucked into the corners of rooms. These were not the discarded refuse of a people cleaning out their homes. These were the essential possessions of a living culture, left as if the inhabitants expected to return within the hour. There is a particular kind of silence that hangs over the later layers of these sites, a silence that extends even to the way the dead were treated. In the earlier, more prosperous centuries, The Ancestral Puebloans honored their ancestors with careful, traditional burials. Bodies were often placed in a flexed position, accompanied by funerary offerings of pottery, turquoise, and feathered robes, reflecting a deep spiritual connection to the journey beyond this life. But in the final years before the Great Abandonment, this tradition began to fracture. In the highest, most defensive cliff dwellings, archaeologists have found remains that were never given a formal burial. Some were left in the corners of rooms or in abandoned kivas, lacking the ritual preparation that had defined their culture for a millennium. It is as if the social fabric had frayed to the point where the living no longer had the time, or perhaps the spirit, to properly care for those who had passed. Perhaps the most enigmatic evidence of this departure lies in the doorways. In many of the great houses, the entrances to rooms have been carefully, intentionally sealed with masonry and mud mortar. This was not a defensive measure against an enemy, but a ritualistic closing. By sealing the doors, the inhabitants were effectively killing the house, finishing its life cycle before they moved on. It is a gesture of finality that resonates through the centuries, a way of saying that this space was no longer for the living. This practice often coincided with the intentional burning of the kivas, the circular, subterranean chambers used for religious ceremonies and community gatherings. To the modern eye, a burned building suggests a catastrophe, an attack, or an accident. But the stratigraphy tells a different story. The fires in these kivas were often controlled and deliberate. The heavy timber roofs were set ablaze, collapsing into the sacred space below, effectively decommissioning the shrine. In the world view of the Ancestral Puebloans, these structures were living entities. When the people left, they could not leave their sacred spaces open or vulnerable to the spirits of the wild. They had to be closed, extinguished, and returned to the earth. The smoke from hundreds of burning kivas must have filled the canyons, a bitter, charcoal-scented shroud, marking the end of an era. As we contemplate these sealed doors and ash-filled pits, we are forced to wonder what kind of pressure could lead a people to systematically destroy their own holiest places. Was it a religious schism? A realization that the gods of the mountains had abandoned them? Or was it a final poetic act of defiance against a changing climate that had turned their verdant gardens into dust? The evidence of the scorched earth and the abandoned corn suggests a culture that was not just moving, but transforming, shedding its old skin with a violent, transformative energy. The mystery deepens when we consider the sheer scale of the abandonment. We are talking about tens of thousands of people, an entire regional population vanishing from the Four Corners area within the span of a single human lifetime. Between the years 1250 and 1300, the vibrant, noisy world of the canyons fell into a profound slumber. The echoes of children playing in the plazas and the rhythmic thumping of the grinding stones were replaced by the lonely cry of the raven and the sighing of the wind through the pines. We often look for a single, smoking gun in archaeology, a war, a plague, a volcanic eruption, but the truth of the cliff dwellings is likely a tapestry of many threads. The Great Drought was the catalyst, but the response was deeply human. It was a crisis of faith as much as a crisis of calories. When the rain stopped falling and the corn withered in the fields, the old ways of living, the great stone towers and the hierarchical societies, must have seemed like a broken promise. The people did not just leave their homes, they left behind a way of being in the world that no longer served them. Imagine the final days in a place like Cliff Palace. The air is thin and dry, the smell of sagebrush heavy in the heat. A family gathers what little they can carry, water skins, a few tools, the most sacred of their ceremonial objects. They look one last time at the walls they built with their own hands, at the soot-stained ceilings where they slept for generations. They do not look back. They walk out of the canyon, following the sun toward the south and the east, leaving the heavy stone metates and the full granaries as offerings to the silence. This was not a disappearance in the way we often think of it. The people did not vanish into thin air. They walked into the future. But the world they left behind remains a haunting testament to the fragility of civilization. The stone cities, tucked into the ribs of the earth, stand as silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of a people who chose to walk away from everything they knew. As we study the unconsumed corn and the sealed doors, we are reminded that history is not just a series of dates, but a collection of moments. Moments of fear, moments of hope, and moments of profound, world-altering decision. The Great Abandonment remains one of the most compelling chapters in the story of North America, a reminder that even the most sophisticated societies are at the mercy of the natural world. The cliffs still hold their breath, waiting for the return of the people, while the slow grind of geological time continues to wear away at the sandstone. The stories are still there, etched into the rock and buried beneath the sand, waiting for those who are patient enough to listen to the whispers of the past. As we move forward into our own uncertain future, we might find wisdom in the ruins, a lesson about the necessity of change, the cost of endurance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit to begin again, even when the world as they knew it has turned to ash and stone. The sound of 1,000 sandals padding across dry earth is a noise that has long since faded into the wind, yet the path they trod remains visible to those who know how to read the landscape. It was not a chaotic flight, but a measured, deliberate exodus, a slow-motion tide of humanity pulling away from the high, cold plateaus of the Four Corners and flowing toward the life-giving veins of the south. As the ancestral Puebloans descended from their cliffside sanctuaries, they were not merely moving between points on a map, they were navigating a profound shift in the very fabric of their identity. The great silence that fell over Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon was matched by a new rising murmur of voices along the banks of the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado River. Here, the water moved with a different rhythm, and the earth offered a different promise. The migrants carried with them the seeds of their past, both literally, in the form of precious heirloom corn, and figuratively, in the stories and ceremonies that defined their soul, but they were also preparing to shed the skin of the old world. As these various groups converged upon the river valleys, a fascinating sociological experiment began to unfold beneath the vast southwestern sky. Clans that had lived in relative isolation for generations, separated by deep canyons and high mesas, now found themselves rubbing shoulders in closer proximity than ever before. This was a time of intense cultural blending, a folding together of different dialects, artistic styles, and religious perspectives. The archaeological record shows us that this was not a simple replacement of one culture by another, but a complex merging. We see it in the pottery, the way the stark, geometric black-on-white designs of the north began to soften and mingle with the vibrant polychrome reds and oranges of the south. It was a visual representation of a people learning to live together in a new way, creating a shared language of symbols to navigate their collective future. The most striking physical evidence of this transition lies in the architecture itself. The era of the Great House, those massive, multi-story complexes that seemed designed to project power and astronomical alignment, began to wane. In their place, we see the rise of the plaza-oriented village. These new settlements were built with a different philosophy in mind, one centered on the open space at the heart of the community rather than the towering walls of an elite dwelling. The plaza became the stage for a new kind of social cohesion, a place where the entire village could gather to witness the dances and ceremonies that bound them together. The kivas, those sacred underground chambers that had once been smaller and more numerous, grew in size, suggesting that the spiritual life of the people was becoming more communal and inclusive. It was as if the great abandonment had taught them that survival depended not on the height of their walls, but on the strength of their shared bonds. To understand the internal logic of this migration, we must look beyond the broken pottery and the stone foundations and listen to the oral traditions of the Hopi and the Zuni. For these descendant communities, the movement south was not a desperate retreat, but a spiritual quest, a series of migrations commanded by the spirits to find the center place. The Hopi speak of a time when they were told to wander the earth, leaving behind their footprints in the form of ruins and petroglyphs, until they found the location where they were meant to settle permanently. Each clan had its own path to follow, its own trials to endure, and its own unique contribution to the eventual gathering of the people. In these stories, the abandonment of the cliff dwellings was a necessary step in a larger, sacred journey, a shedding of the old to make room for the new. The Zuni, too, tell of a long search for the middle of the world, a place of balance and stability where the people could finally rest. These traditions remind us that history is not just a sequence of climate data and resource depletion, but a narrative of meaning and purpose. As the years passed and the new settlements flourished, the memories of the old northern homelands began to take on a legendary quality. The canyons of the north became the place of the emergence, a sacred ancestral realm that was always present in the mind, even if it was no longer inhabited by the living. The transition to the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado was not merely a change in geography, but a change in the way the people related to the land and to each other. They were no longer the people of the cliffs, peering out from the shadows of the rock. They were the people of the river and the plaza, living in the bright, open light of a new social order. The technical term for this period, the Pueblo IV period, hardly captures the vibrancy of this cultural rebirth. It was a time of intense creativity, where the pressures of migration acted as a catalyst for new forms of social organization and religious expression. Imagine the scene along the Rio Grande in the late 13th century. The air would have been thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The sound of stone adzes striking timber would have echoed through the valley as new homes were raised, and the chatter of children playing in the shallows of the river would have provided a constant backdrop to the work of the adults. These were not a broken people, they were a resilient people, adapting to a new environment with a sophistication that continues to baffle modern researchers. They brought with them advanced irrigation techniques, turning the floodplains of the river into a lush tapestry of corn, beans, and squash. They were masters of their environment, capable of reading the subtle cues of the seasons and the soil, ensuring that even in this new land, the lifeblood of their society would continue to flow. Yet, even in these thriving new villages, the shadows of the past remained. The knowledge of why they had left the north, the droughts, the social strife, the shifting spiritual alignments, was woven into the stories told around the evening fires. They knew that stability was a fragile thing and that the earth could be a fickle provider. This awareness seems to have fostered a culture of humility and cooperation, a recognition that the individual's well-being was inextricably linked to the well-being of the group. The Great Migration was a crucible, and the society that emerged from it was one tempered by hardship and refined by the necessity of change. As we look across the centuries at these sprawling plaza villages, we see the foundations of the modern Pueblo world. The traditions that were forged in the heat of the migration continue to be practiced today in the villages of the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Rio Grande Pueblos. The movement south was not an end, but a transformation, a bridge between the ancient mysteries of the cliff dwellings and the living culture of the present. The path they took, though marked by the dust of centuries, remains a testament to the enduring power of a people to reinvent themselves, to find new rivers to follow, and to build new centers for their world when the old ones have fallen silent. The desert holds these stories close, tucked away in the layers of sediment and the echoes of the canyon walls, reminding us that even the greatest of abandonments is often just the beginning of a different, deeper kind of belonging. Deep within the silent reaches of the sandstone canyons, a new kind of shadow began to stretch across the rock faces, one that did not belong to the clouds or the shifting light of the seasons. It was the shadow of a changing spirit. As the old world of the Chacoan kings crumbled, a profound shift in the very soul of the people began to manifest in the things they left behind. If you were to walk along the base of these cliffs today, your fingers might brush against the cold, stippled surface of a petroglyph, a carving in the stone, and you would feel the transition beneath your fingertips. For centuries, the art of the ancestral Puebloans had been a language of geometry. It was a world of sharp angles, intricate spirals, and zigzag lines that mirrored the precision of their masonry and the mathematical certainty of their lunar calendars. These patterns were cold, distant, and perhaps representative of a rigid social order where the stars dictated the movements of men. But as the great abandonment accelerated, these abstract shapes began to fade, replaced by something startlingly human. New figures emerged from the rock, anthropomorphic beings with wide eyes, elaborate headdresses, and hands held aloft as if in prayer or dance. These were the first depictions of the Katsinam, the spirit messengers who bridged the gap between the earthly realm and the divine. This was more than a mere change in artistic preference. It was a theological revolution. The old hierarchical system, centered in the massive great houses of Chaco Canyon, had been built on a foundation of elite power and celestial observation. It was a system where a few likely held the secrets of the sun, mediating between the heavens and the common farmer. But as the rains failed and the corn withered, that old mediation proved hollow. The people began to reject the grand, distant authority of the Chacoan priests in favor of a more communal, more intimate relationship with the sacred. The emergence of the Katsina cult acted as a powerful unifying force, a social glue that bound disparate groups together during a time of terrifying upheaval. In the new villages, the kivas, those subterranean circular rooms used for ceremony, became more central, more integrated into the daily life of the entire community. Religion was no longer a spectacle to be viewed from afar. It was a collective performance. The Katsinam were not distant gods, but ancestors and spirits of nature who returned to the villages to dance among the living, bringing with them the promise of moisture and the renewal of life. They represented a democratization of the divine, a shift from the rule of the few to the participation of the many. As the years passed and the migration southward continued, this spiritual evolution became tethered to a profound concept in Pueblo theology, the search for the center place. To the modern observer, the abandonment of the Four Corners region looks like a retreat, a desperate flight from drought and conflict. But through the lens of their own beliefs, it may have been a pilgrimage. The oral traditions speak of a people who were told they must wander, testing the land, until they found the spot where the earth felt balanced, the middle of the world. Each village they built, each cliff dwelling they carved, was a temporary stop on a much longer journey toward a spiritual destination that had not yet been reached. This seeking of the center suggests that the abandonment was not just an end, but a purposeful movement toward a new way of being. They were leaving behind the rigid, crumbling structures of the past to find a place where the community could exist in harmony with the spirits and each other. The old Chacoan roads, which once stretched out in straight, uncompromising lines across the desert, were being replaced by the winding, organic paths of the migrants. In this period of transition, the very air of the southwest must have felt heavy with the weight of these new ideas. Imagine the scene in a crowded pueblo during a winter ceremony. The smell of burning pinon wood hangs thick in the air. The rhythmic thud of feet on the hard-packed earth echoes against the canyon walls, a heartbeat for the village. Dancers, masked and painted to represent the spirits of the mountains and the clouds, move in unison. There is no king here, no high priest elevated above the rest. There is only the collective breath of a people trying to survive by turning inward toward one another and upward toward the spirits they believed could save them. The rock art from this era reflects this newfound focus on the community. We see processions of figures holding hands, flute players whose music was said to carry the seeds of life, and depictions of shields and warriors that suggest a need for protection in a changing landscape. The anthropomorphic figures, those human-like shapes, often have large square shoulders and intricate patterns on their bodies, representing the regalia of the different clans. It was as if the people were literally carving their new identity into the bones of the earth, ensuring that even if they moved on, the memory of their transformation would remain. Archaeologists use the term stratigraphy to describe the layers of history buried in the soil, with the oldest events at the bottom and the newest at the top. When they look at the layers from the late 13th century, they see a dramatic break in the material culture. The pottery changes, the architecture changes, and the very way people organize their homes changes. This isn't just the result of a few dry years, it is the evidence of a total cultural reimagining. The hierarchy of Chaco was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a more egalitarian structure that prioritized the survival of the group over the glorification of the individual. This rejection of the old ways was likely a slow and painful process. There must have been those who clung to the ancient traditions, who believed that if they only performed the old rituals more perfectly, the rains would return to the great houses. But as the dust storms grew more frequent and the springs began to dry up, the voice of the new movement grew louder. The Katsina cult offered a hope that the old system could not, a hope based on cooperation, on the sharing of resources, and on a direct, personal connection to the forces of nature. As they moved toward the south and the east, toward the Rio Grande and the high mesas of the south, they took this new theology with them. The cliff dwellings they left behind were not just empty buildings, they were the discarded shells of a former life. The center place was not a fixed point on a map, but a state of being that they were constantly striving to reach. The abandonment was the physical manifestation of a spiritual exodus. We often wonder what it felt like to be the last person to walk out of a canyon like Long House or Cliff Palace. Did they look back at the towers and the plazas with regret or with a sense of relief? Perhaps, in their minds, the buildings had already served their purpose. They were vessels that had held the people for a time, but the spirit of the community had already migrated elsewhere. The stone and mortar were merely the physical husks of a civilization that was busy being reborn in the valleys of the south. The desert wind now whistles through the empty doorways, carrying away the echoes of the old Chacoan chants and replacing them with the silence of the ages. But in that silence, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the soft shuffle of the dancers' feet and the low hum of a people who realized that their survival depended not on the height of their walls or the precision of their calendars, but on the strength of the bonds between them. The religious transformation was the bridge they built to cross the abyss of the Great Drought, a bridge made of stories, spirits, and the shared dream of a center place that lay just beyond the next horizon. The silence that followed the final departure was not a void, but a long, slow inhalation by the desert itself. As the last echoes of human speech faded into the sandstone alcoves, the canyons entered a period of profound stillness that would last for hundreds of years, a deep geological sleep where time seemed to fold in upon itself. Because the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their homes with such startling finality, They left behind a fossilized moment in human history, preserved by the very aridity that had driven them away. The dry, thin air of the high plateau acted as a natural tomb, one that did not decay, but rather mummified the remnants of a vanished way of life. High up in the shadows of the overhangs, the great wooden beams, the Douglas firs and ponderosa pines hauled from distant mountains, remained wedged in their masonry sockets. These beams are the silent timekeepers of the southwest, holding within their rings the precise record of every rainfall and every season of thirst. Through the science of dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, we can see that these timbers did not rot. They simply hardened into stone-like density, holding up roofs that no longer sheltered anyone. Below them, on the cool dirt floors of the rooms, the more delicate artifacts of daily life endured. Yucca fiber sandals, woven with intricate patterns that mirrored the pottery, lay where they were kicked off. Baskets, tightly coiled and stained with the ghosts of corn and beans, sat in the corners of darkened granaries. Even the turkey feather blankets, soft and insulating, survived the passage of centuries, their fibers held together by the lack of moisture and the protection of the overhanging rock. As the years stretched into decades, the desert began the slow process of reclamation. It was a gentle invasion, led by the wind and the winged. Dust, carried on the fierce spring gales, began to settle in the plazas, forming thin layers of sediment that buried the hearths and the discarded sherds of corrugated pottery. This natural stratigraphy, the layering of earth over time, acted as a protective shroud, sealing the story of the great abandonment away from the elements. The desert flora, patient and resilient, crept toward the stone walls. Sagebrush and rabbitbrush took root in the plazas where children once played, their silvery green leaves shivering in the breeze. Prickly pear cacti pushed through the cracks in the masonry, their roots prying gently at the mortar, while the twisted shapes of juniper trees stood like sentinels at the entrances to the canyons. The fauna of the Four Corners region found new sanctuaries within these hollowed-out cities. Mountain lions, seeking shade from the midday sun, padded softly through the kivas, their golden eyes reflecting the dim light of the underground chambers. Great horned owls nested in the high, inaccessible windows of the cliff dwellings, their low, rhythmic hooting becoming the new heartbeat of the ruins. Pack rats, the unintentional curators of the ancient world, gathered bits of cloth, corn cobs and charcoal, dragging them into deep crevices to build their middens. These nests, crystallized by the animal's waste over hundreds of years, have become treasure troves for modern researchers, preserving organic materials that would otherwise have vanished into dust. In the absence of man, the cliff dwellings became a vibrant, non-human hive, a place where the boundary between the built environment and the natural world slowly dissolved. Meanwhile, the landscape surrounding the empty mesas was not entirely devoid of human presence. As the centuries turned, new groups of people began to filter into the region, moving through the valleys and over the plateaus that the ancestral Puebloans had left behind. The Ute people, nomadic hunters and gatherers, moved across the high country, their lives attuned to the migrations of elk and the ripening of wild berries. To them, the stone cities in the cliffs were places of mystery and power, the homes of the ancient ones who had gone before. They treated these sites with a mixture of reverence and caution, rarely choosing to inhabit the structures themselves, perhaps sensing the weight of the history that saturated the stones. Later, the Diné, the people we now know as the Navajo, arrived from the north, bringing with them a different way of relating to the land. They encountered the sprawling ruins of Chaco Canyon and the hidden alcoves of Mesa Verde, naming the former inhabitants the Anasazi, a word that has been translated as ancient enemies or ancient outsiders. For the Navajo, these ruins were not merely piles of stone, but places inhabited by spirits, where the past remained tangibly present. They wove the existence of these ghost cities into their own cosmology, respecting the boundaries of the ruins and leaving the artifacts undisturbed. It is perhaps due to this cultural hesitation to disturb the sites that the cliff dwellings remained so remarkably intact until the modern era. The newcomers were the guardians of a silence they did not fully understand, allowing the ghost cities to sleep undisturbed while the world outside continued to change. And so, the sites sat in a state of suspended animation. The sun rose and set, casting long amber shadows across the face of the cliffs, while the moon turned the sandstone to a ghostly white. The great drought that had forced the exodus eventually broke, and the rains returned, turning the canyon floors green once more. But there was no one left to plant the corn. The irrigation ditches filled with silt, and the hand and toe trails carved into the vertical rock faces began to smooth over, worn down by the patient touch of wind and water. The abandonment was so complete, and the preservation so absolute, that when explorers from faraway lands finally stumbled upon these places in the 19th century, they felt as though they had stepped through a tear in the fabric of time. They found rooms where the soot from the last fire still blackened the ceiling, and mugs that still bore the thumbprints of the potters who had shaped them. It was as if the inhabitants had simply stepped out for a moment and might return at any second to reclaim their seats by the fire. This sense of immediate absence is what gives the cliff dwellings their haunting quality. A feeling that the air is still thick with the prayers and the worries of 1,000 people. The great abandonment was not a death, but a relocation. Yet the shells they left behind became monuments to a specific way of being in the world, a way that was intimately tied to the stone, the sky, and the cycles of the seasons. As we look at these sites today, we are seeing the results of 700 years of solitude. We see the strength of the masonry that has withstood the tremors of the earth and the weight of the snow. We see the brilliance of a people who knew how to harvest the sun's warmth in the winter and seek the shadow's embrace in the summer. But more than that, we see the limit of our own understanding. The ghost cities of the American Southwest remain one of the most poignant reminders of the fragility of civilization. They remind us that even the most sophisticated societies are guests of the climate, and that when the balance shifts, all that remains are the stones, the silence, and the stories we tell to fill the void. The timbers continue to hold their breath in the dry air, waiting for a return that will never come, while the desert continues its slow, beautiful work of turning architecture back into earth. Imagine, if you will, a single grain of dust resting upon a silver-grey canyon ledge, a microscopic witness to 7 centuries of stillness. For a long time, we believed that the story of the Ancestral Puebloans was written only in the visible stone and the broken pottery scattered across the mesa floor. We looked at the empty windows of Cliff Palace and saw only a haunting absence, a riddle whose answer had vanished with the people who once called these heights home. But in our modern era, the silence of the desert is beginning to speak in a different frequency as we turn the lens of 21st century technology toward the ancient world, peeling back the layers of time with a precision that would have seemed like sorcery to the early explorers. The shadows of the canyon are no longer as impenetrable as they once were. High above the juniper and the sagebrush, aircraft now glide through the thin mountain air, carrying sensors that pulse with invisible light. This is LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, a technology that sends millions of laser points down to the earth, piercing through the dense canopy of forests and the thickets of scrub oak that have reclaimed the land. When the data is processed, the vegetation simply melts away on the computer screen, revealing the skeletal structure of the landscape beneath. What emerged from these digital excavations was breathtaking. We discovered that the great cliff dwellings were not isolated fortresses, but hubs in a vast, interconnected web. Hidden beneath the soil and the roots of centuries, a massive network of roads began to appear. Perfectly straight lines that ignored the geography of the land, stretching for miles across the high desert. These were not merely footpaths worn by casual travel, but engineered thoroughfares, some 30 feet wide, connecting distant communities to the great ceremonial centers. It suggests a society far more organized and expansive than we ever dared to imagine. A civilization that mapped its world with geometric precision, even as the clouds began to fail them. As we look closer, down into the very marrow of the past, the story becomes even more intimate. Archaeologists have turned to isotopic analysis, a method of studying the chemical signatures left behind in organic remains, to trace the movements of life itself. By examining the oxygen and strontium isotopes trapped within the enamel of ancient teeth and the delicate lattice of turkey bones, researchers can determine exactly where an animal or a person grew up. It is a form of biological storytelling. The water a creature drinks and the plants it eats leave a permanent geographic fingerprint in its body, tied to the specific geology of a region. We are finding that the thousands of turkeys kept by the Anasazi were not always raised in the backyard of the cliff dwellings. Some were brought from great distances, suggesting a complex system of trade and animal husbandry that spanned hundreds of miles. Even the human remains tell a story of migration and silver-threaded connection, revealing that the people who left the Four Corners region did not simply vanish into the ether, but moved with purpose, carrying their lineage and their traditions to the south and east, where their descendants live to this day. While the bones tell us who the people were, computer modeling is helping us understand the world they were forced to navigate. In quiet laboratories, scientists have built digital versions of the ancient climate, feeding centuries of tree ring data into complex algorithms to recreate the rainfall patterns of the 1200s. These paleoclimate models allow us to see the drought not just as a single event, but as a slow, agonizing pulse of heat and hunger. We can now watch, year by year, as the soil moisture evaporated and the corn yields dwindled. The models show a society pushed to its absolute limit, a world where the rains arrived just late enough to kill the sprouts, or the frosts came just early enough to wither the harvest. It was a game of margins so thin that even a slight shift in the wind could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. We see now that the abandonment wasn't a sudden, panicked flight, but a calculated response to a landscape that had stopped providing the one thing life requires: a future. Yet, for all the power of our lasers and our chemistry, there is a dimension of this history that cannot be found in a laboratory. In recent years, a profound shift has occurred in the way we study these ancient sites. The cold, objective gaze of Western science has begun to harmonize with a much older form of knowledge. Collaborative research between archaeologists and tribal elders from the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblos has transformed our understanding of the Great Abandonment. For the descendants of those who built the cliff dwellings, these sites are not ruins, nor are they abandoned. They are living places, inhabited by the spirits of the ancestors and the memory of a journey. The elders speak of the migrations not as a tragedy, but as a fulfillment of a spiritual cycle, a necessary movement toward a promised land. When a scientist looks at a specialized piece of pottery and sees a cultural marker, a tribal historian might see a specific prayer or a map of a clan's travels. This partnership has brought a new warmth to the cold stone of the canyons. It reminds us that the people who climbed the wooden ladders into the clouds were not just subjects of a forensic study, but fathers, mothers, and dreamers who viewed their environment through a lens of deep sacredness. They did not leave because they were defeated. They left because it was time to move on, following a path that had been whispered to them in the rustle of the dry corn husks and the patterns of the stars. As we sit with these findings, the LiDAR maps, the isotopic signatures, the ancient stories, the mystery of the Anasazi begins to feel less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a poem to be felt. We realize that the hurry in which they left was perhaps not a flight from an enemy, but a swift collective realization that the earth was asking them to change. The forensic evidence shows us the how and the when, but the collaboration with the living culture gives us the why. It is a reminder that history is never truly buried. It is merely waiting for us to develop the eyes to see it, and the patience to listen to what the wind is carrying through the empty doorways of the mesa. The deeper we go into the data, the more we see the echoes of our own world reflected in the dust of the 13th century. The computer models don't just show us the past, they show us the resilience of the human spirit when faced with an unfolding crisis. They show us a people who were capable of immense cooperation, who managed their resources with incredible skill until the very environment itself shifted beneath their feet. We are learning that the cliff dwellings were not a failed experiment, but a masterpiece of adaptation that lasted for centuries. A testament to what can be achieved when a society lives in a delicate, intentional dance with the rain and the sun. And as the modern world grapples with its own shifting climates, the forensic record of the Southwest stands as a silent, stony teacher, offering lessons in humility and the enduring strength of the human journey through deep time. The scent of dried sagebrush and sun-warmed cedar still lingers in the air of the high plateau, a fragrance that has remained unchanged for 1,000 years. It is a scent that bridges the gap between the silent stone galleries of the past and the vibrant, living breath of the present. While the great stone houses of the Mesa Verde and the subterranean kivas of Chaco Canyon stand as monuments to a time of departure, they are not tombs of a vanished race. To look upon these ruins and see only an ending is to misunderstand the very nature of the people who built them. The story did not stop when the last fire was extinguished in the cliff dwellings. It simply shifted its location, flowing like seasonal meltwater from the high mesas down toward the banks of the Rio Grande and the crimson mesas of the western deserts. The descendants of those who climbed the finger holds of the canyon walls are very much alive today, dwelling in the pueblos of New Mexico and the Hopi mesas of Arizona. In these communities, the ancient songs are still sung, and the rhythm of the corn-growing cycle continues to dictate the pace of life, just as it did when the towers of Cliff Palace were new. The continuity of this culture is a quiet marvel of human history, a golden thread that was never severed, only woven into a new pattern. When we walk through the plazas of Acoma or Taos, we are seeing the direct evolution of the architects of Chaco. The transition was not a collapse, but a migration, a deliberate choice to seek a new way of being in a world that had grown cold and dry. It was a reinvention of the self, a shedding of old skins to survive a changing climate. Modern science, using the precise tools of radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint the age of organic remains, and dendrochronology, has confirmed what the oral traditions of the Pueblo people have always maintained. The movement out of the Four Corners region was a slow, organized journey. As the drought of the late 13th century deepened, the people did not simply scatter into the void. They carried their identity with them. They brought their seeds, their pottery styles, and their profound understanding of the stars. They learned the hard lessons of the fragile ecosystem they inhabited, understanding that to stay too long in one place, to take more than the earth could give, was to invite a slow decline. Their departure was an act of humility, an acknowledgement that even the most magnificent stone cities must eventually yield to the limits of the natural world. There is a profound resilience in this history, a reminder that survival often requires the courage to walk away from what we have built. The Great Abandonment was not a failure of will, but a triumph of adaptability. Today, the sites of Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon are recognized as World Heritage Sites, protected not just as archaeological curiosities, but as sacred landscapes that continue to speak to the human spirit. They stand as silent teachers, offering a forensic record of how a society copes with the unpredictable whims of the sky. In the stillness of these canyons, one can almost feel the weight of deep time, the sense that our own era is but a brief flicker in the long, enduring story of those who learned to dance with the rain. As we look upon the masonry, where the fingerprints of the builders are still visible in the mortar, we see a reflection of our own search for balance in a world that remains as beautiful and as precarious as it was 10 centuries ago. As the years passed and the dust settled over the empty plazas of the north, the new settlements to the south began to flourish. These were not mere copies of the old ways, but a refinement. The lessons learned in the shadow of the cliffs were applied to the river valleys, creating an enduring legacy of sustainable living that has lasted for another 700 years. The resilience of the Pueblo people serves as a testament to the strength of communal identity, a force capable of weathering centuries of environmental and social upheaval. The stone walls of the ancestors may be silent, but the culture they birthed remains a vibrant, breathing presence, a reminder that while cities may fall, the spirit of a people, rooted in the earth and the sky, is truly timeless. A heavy, silver stillness settles over the canyon floor, a silence so profound it seems to have its own weight, its own ancient pulse. Under the cool, pale light of a high desert moon, the sandstone walls of the alcove lose their fiery daytime oranges and ochres, turning instead to shades of charcoal, ash, and bone. The great dwellings, tucked deep within the protective embrace of the overhanging rock, appear less like man-made structures and more like natural outcroppings, a seamless extension of the geology itself. To look upon these empty rooms now is to witness a conversation between the earth and those who once sought refuge within it, a dialogue that has continued long after the last human voice faded into the wind. The shadows in the doorways are deep and impenetrable, like ink spilled onto the stone, hiding the floors where corn was once ground, and the hearths where small fires once crackled against the winter chill. And so, we walk in our mind's eye through the narrow plazas where the dust of 8 centuries has settled in a soft, uniform layer over the cobbles. The air here is thin and crisp, carrying the sharp, resinous scent of pinon pine and the dry, dusty aroma of sun-baked juniper. There is a specific sound that defines this landscape, a low, mournful sigh as the breeze funnels through the narrow gaps between the canyon walls, stirring the needles of the trees, but leaving the heavy stone blocks of the houses unmoved. It is a sound that has not changed since the 13th century, a constant companion to the generations who watched these same stars trace their slow, circular paths across the vault of the black sky. As the hours of the night pass, the moonlight shifts, illuminating the fine details of the masonry. You can see the individual fingerprints of the builders pressed into the mortar, preserved for eternity in the arid climate. These are the tactile signatures of a people who were not merely passing through, but who poured their labor and their hope into every leveled course of stone. There are small, T-shaped doorways that seem designed to keep the warmth in and the spirits of the restless wind out, and high, narrow windows that acted as celestial calendars, marking the precise moment when the winter sun would touch a specific mark on the back wall. The sophistication of their understanding, a marriage of architecture and astronomy, suggests a society that felt deeply synchronized with the rhythms of the cosmos. Yet the central mystery remains, hanging in the air like the fine grit of a summer dust storm. Why, after centuries of refinement and deep connection to this specific place, did they leave so abruptly? We look at the artifacts left behind, the heavy grinding stones known as metates, the beautifully painted ceramic bowls, the woven yucca sandals, and we feel the phantom pressure of a decision made in haste. It was not a slow fading away, a gradual thinning of the population over many generations. The archaeological record, through the precise science of dendrochronology or tree ring dating, tells us that the construction simply stopped. The hammers went silent. The fires were allowed to go out. Within the span of a single lifetime, these bustling vertical cities became ghost towns, their inhabitants moving toward the south and the east, seeking a new way of being in a world that had become increasingly unstable. Perhaps the great abandonment was not a failure of the people, but a necessary evolution, a realization that the land needed to rest. We often view the collapse of a civilization as a tragedy, a final ending written in the rubble of its monuments. But for the people of the cliffs, it may have been a profound act of survival and wisdom. They understood the limits of the soil and the temperament of the rains. When the Great Drought of the late 1200s took hold, turning the life-giving springs into trickles of mud, they did not cling to their stone fortresses until they perished. Instead, they chose movement over stagnation. They chose the horizon over the wall. Meanwhile, the canyon itself began the long process of reclaiming what had been borrowed. The piñon pines grew taller, their roots prying gently at the foundations of the lower rooms. The hawks and the owls returned to the high ledges, nesting in the rafters of abandoned granaries. Nature does not mourn the loss of human presence. It simply fills the vacuum with a different kind of life. The structures we see today are in a state of arrested decay, held in a delicate balance by the dry air and the shelter of the cliffs. They exist in a liminal space, neither fully part of the present nor entirely erased by the past. It is in this quiet contemplation that we find the true resonance of the cliff dwellings. They serve as a mirror, reflecting our own concerns about sustainability, climate, and the fragility of the systems we build to protect ourselves. We look at the empty kivas, the circular, underground ceremonial chambers, and imagine the chanting and the smoke that once rose from their roofs, connecting the people to the underworld and the heavens. Now those chambers hold only the silence of the earth, a deep, resonant hum that seems to vibrate in the very marrow of your bones if you sit still enough to listen. The mystery of their departure is not a puzzle to be solved with a single answer, but a story to be felt, a narrative of transition that reminds us that all things, even the most solid of stones, are subject to the tides of time. As the moon begins its long descent toward the western rim, the shadows stretch and merge, blurring the lines between the ruins and the rock. The cycle of civilizations is much like the cycle of the seasons or the phases of the moon itself. There is a time for building, a time for dwelling, and a time for letting go. The ancestral Puebloans left behind a blueprint of resilience, a reminder that the spirit of a culture is not contained within its buildings, but in the collective memory and the adaptability of its people. The stone walls may be cold to the touch, but the legacy of those who shaped them remains a vibrant thread in the tapestry of the American Southwest. The wind picks up slightly, carrying the faint, ghostly rattle of dry leaves against the canyon floor. It is a lonely sound, yet it is not a sad one. There is a peace in this abandonment, a sense that the canyon has returned to a natural equilibrium. The stars above continue their indifferent watch, the same constellations that guided the travelers 700 years ago as they walked away from these cliffs and into a new future. We are merely brief visitors in this landscape of deep time, catching a glimpse of a story that is still being written in the dust and the wind. And so, we leave the dwellings to the night. We leave the empty rooms to the mice and the moonlight, and the silent plazas to the memories of those who once called this vertical world home. The great abandonment was not an end, but a transformation, a shedding of one skin to grow another. As we close our eyes and let the image of the moonlit cliffs fade into the darkness of sleep, we carry with us the quiet strength of the stone and the enduring mystery of the people who knew when it was time to move on. The canyon rests, as it always has, cradling the remnants of a vanished age in the hollow of its hand, waiting for the slow, inevitable turning of the world to bring another dawn to the silent reaches of the high desert. The story of the cliffs is a story of harmony found, lost, and sought again, a reminder that we are all, in our own way, just passing through, seeking a place where the earth and the sky meet in perfect, enduring silence.